Good evening, everyone. Tonight we will enter the world of quiet gardens and whispered secrets, where ancient stones hold more than just history, and a seemingly tranquil village harbors depths of human nature few ever truly see. In the heart of St. Mary Mead, where the rhythm of life is slow and predictable, sometimes the most profound mysteries unfold, not with a bang, but with a barely perceptible ripple. Our guide through these delicate currents of suspicion and hidden motives will be a woman whose eyes miss nothing, whose mind connects every thread, and whose understanding of the human heart is as vast as the countryside itself. Prepare to listen closely, for in the quietest corners the truth often hides. Now let's start with the first chapter of Whispers by the Stained Glass Window. Chapter 1. The Unsettling Arrival of Mr. Finch. The autumn wind, sharp and carrying the scent of damp earth and wood smoke, rustled through the ancient elms lining the lane to St. Mary Mead. It was late September in the year of our Lord, 1928, and a particular hush had fallen over the village, not entirely due to the changing season. Miss Jane Marple, seated by her drawing-room window with her knitting, observed the shift in the air with the quiet intensity of a seasoned naturalist. Her needles clicked softly, a rhythmic counterpoint to the village's usual murmur. But today, that murmur was laced with a new, distinct undertone, curiosity tinged with a dash of apprehension. The cause of this subtle perturbation was the recent arrival, or rather, the return, of Mr. Alistair Finch to Finch Manor. The manor, a grand but somewhat dilapidated Georgian house on the outskirts of the village, had stood empty for decades, a silent monument to a bygone era. Mr. Finch, a distant cousin of the original Finch family, had purchased it sight unseen, returning to his ancestral roots after a lifetime spent making a considerable fortune in the colonies. He was, by all accounts, a man of 50-odd years, described variously as portly by Mrs. Witherall at the post office, rather severe-looking by young Bert Higgins, the delivery boy, and undeniably wealthy by practically everyone. His arrival had been a flurry of activity, new servants, gardeners attacking the overgrown wilderness with unprecedented vigor, and decorators descending from London in motor cars that sent plumes of dust swirling down the lane. Such a spectacle was rare in St. Mary Mead, usually content with its own gentle pace. Yet it wasn't merely the disruption that caused Miss Marple's brow to furrow almost imperceptibly as she turned a heel in her sock. It was the quality of the gossip that had begun to circulate, like an insidious weed spreading through a meticulously tended garden. "He's a man who expects things his own way," Mrs. Witherall had confided to Miss Marple over a cup of tea just yesterday. "Haughty, if you ask me, and those eyes, piercing, doesn't look at you so much as through you." Miss Marple had simply nodded, her gaze fixed on a distant flock of starlings, but her mind had already begun to sort through Mrs. Witherall's rather dramatic pronouncements, sifting for the kernel of truth. Mrs. Witherall, for all her exaggerations, was an excellent barometer of local sentiment. Mr. Finch had, in his short time, managed to alienate the vicar with his blunt refusal to contribute to the church roof fund. "My dear man, I bought the house, not the entire village's financials. Burdens. Dekos had upset the local tradesman by importing most of his goods from London, and generally established himself as a man of formidable, if not entirely pleasant presence. He was a creature of habit, too, a brisk, solitary walk through his grounds, at precisely 10 a.m., a late afternoon drive to the nearest market town, and evenings spent, presumably, alone in his vast, newly renovated library. Miss Marple's understanding of human nature, honed by decades of observing the everyday dramas of St. Mary Mead, told her that such a man, however wealthy, could not arrive without stirring the pot. He was a stone dropped into still water, and the ripples, however small, would reach every corner. And indeed they had begun to do so. Young Bessie, one of the new housemaids at Finch Manor, had been overheard weeping by the kitchen door, muttering, Something about unreasonable demands and a terrible temper. Mr. Davies, the postman, reported seeing Mr. Finch's usually stoic butler, Jameson, looking unusually harried. But it was a conversation overheard at the village shop that truly snagged Miss Marple's attention this afternoon. Mrs. Garside, the grocer's wife, a woman known for her keen ear and even keener tongue, was relaying the latest tidbit to a small, breathless cluster of women. And he dismissed poor Mr. Abernathy, the head gardener, only last week, after Abernathy had tended those grounds for 20 years, said his roses weren't up to scratch. Imagine! The man's a brute, I tell you. A murmur of agreement ran through the shop. Mr. Abernathy, a quiet, diligent man, was well liked. Dismissing him so summarily was seen as a grave affront to village sensibilities. As Miss Marple mentally filed this information away, her attention was drawn to the figure hurrying past her window. It was Dr. Haydock, his usually brisk stride now bordering on a controlled run, his bag clutched tightly in his hand, his face set in an expression of grim determination. He was heading in the direction of Finch Manor. Miss Marple's needles stilled. Dr. Haydock was not a man to rush unless urgency dictated. A sudden illness, perhaps? Mr. Finch, though outwardly robust, was of an age where such things were not uncommon. Yet an instinct, cold and undeniable, whispered to Miss Marple that this particular urgency felt different. It carried the faint, unsettling echo of something far more serious than a simple, seasonal malady. The first faint ripple of a deep disturbance had just reached her quiet cottage. What followed, she knew, could be anything but peaceful. Chapter 2. A Death in the Manor and Lingering Doubts. The village, usually a symphony of muted sounds, a distant dog bark, the clatter of a delivery cart, the drone of the church clock, fell into a strained silence as Dr. Haydock's motor car, after a conspicuously long stay at Finch Manor, finally sped away. It was not long before the news, carried on the invisible currents of village telepathy, began to filter through. Mr. Alistair Finch was dead. Heart failure, they say, Mrs. Witherall informed Miss Marple, her voice hushed, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and morbid fascination. She had bustled over almost immediately, a small shawl clutched tightly around her shoulders as if against a sudden chill. The doctor was there for hours, found him in his library, quite peaceful, apparently, just gone. Miss Marple listened, her gaze thoughtful, as she offered Mrs. Witherall a cup of chamomile tea. Peaceful, you say? That is a mercy, at least. Well, yes, but so sudden, wasn't it? Only moved back a month ago, full of vigor, and all that fuss with the renovations, the new staff. One would think he had years ahead of him. Mrs. Witherall took a sip of tea, her eyes darting to Miss Marple's face, seeking confirmation or perhaps a shared sense of unease. Miss Marple merely nodded, allowing the silence to stretch, her mind already working. Vigor, Mrs. Witherall had said. Indeed, Mr. Finch, for all his disagreeable nature, had presented a picture of robust, if somewhat overfed health. A sudden heart attack was certainly possible, especially for a man of his age and sedentary habits, but something didn't quite sit right. It was a subtle discord, like a slightly off-key note, in an otherwise familiar melody. Later that afternoon, Detective Inspector Craddock, a man known to Miss Marple from previous village unfortunate incidents, arrived from the county town. His presence, though discreet, was a stark reminder that even in St. Mary Mead, death sometimes required more than a doctor's signature. He was a professional, thorough, and generally sensible, but Miss Marple had always found his reliance on tangible evidence sometimes made him blind to the more subtle clues. The nuances of character, the hidden currents of emotion that often truly explained a situation. She saw him later, walking past her cottage with the local constable, P.C. Troughton. Craddock looked preoccupied but not overtly suspicious. A routine inquiry then, rather than an immediate criminal investigation. This confirmed Mrs. Witherall's report. The official verdict for now was natural causes. Yet, as the days passed, a new kind of whisper began to circulate. It wasn't about the manor's ghost, nor the usual village gossip. It was about Mr. Finch himself and the reactions of those closest to him. Jameson, the butler, a man of impeccably starched collars and an iron composure, was observed by young Bert Higgins, the delivery boy, stumbling out of the back door of the manor, looking utterly distraught. Like he'd seen a ghost, Bert reported, breathlessly to his mother. "And he's never like that, Mum, always so straight." Then there was Miss Evangeline Finch, Alistair's much younger niece, who had only arrived at the manor a week before his death. A striking young woman with auburn hair and eyes that seemed to hold a perpetual sadness, she had been invited by her uncle to keep him company. Or so the story went. She was now a picture of grief, seen only fleetingly at the manor windows, a dark, solitary figure. But Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, who had called to offer condolences, mentioned that Miss Finch had seemed oddly withdrawn, almost relieved, though she tried to hide it. This particular observation settled in Miss Marple's mind like a stone. Relief at her uncle's death? And then there was Mr. Abernathy, the recently dismissed head gardener. He had been seen by Farmer Giles staggering out of the village pub, the Red Lion, rather earlier than usual, looking unusually flushed. When Giles had offered his condolences about Mr. Finch, Abernathy had simply grunted, "Good riddance to bad rubbish, if you ask me." A shocking sentiment, even for a man recently wronged, and one that quickly found its way to Miss Marple's ears. Each snippet of information, each observation, was like a tiny, irregularly shaped piece of a jigsaw puzzle. On their own, they meant little. But Miss Marple knew from long experience that it was the way these pieces fitted together, or more importantly, failed to fit together, that often revealed the true picture. The official pronouncement of heart failure might satisfy the county authorities, but it did not entirely satisfy Miss Marple. There was a subtle discord in the air, a faint lingering perfume of something not quite right, and the source of that scent, she suspected, lay not in the physical ailment of Mr. Finch, but in the intricate, often tangled webs of human emotion and motive that surrounded him. The quiet village, it seemed, had begun to hum with an unspoken question. Chapter 3. Whispers of the Will and a Broken Vase. The funeral of Mr. Alistair Finch was a subdued affair, reflecting the deceased's somewhat reclusive and unpopular nature. Few villagers attended, aside from a scattering of curious onlookers, and those like Miss Marple, who felt it their duty to pay respects, however formal. Miss Evangeline Finch, draped in black, appeared fragile and distant, a somber echo of the manor's now permanent gloom. Jameson, the butler, stood rigid, his grief a tight, almost suffocating mask. After the short service, the talk inevitably turned to the will. Mr. Finch, being a man of considerable means, was naturally the subject of intense speculation. It was well known he had no direct heirs, a fact that had for weeks fueled a quiet undercurrent of hope among various distant relatives and some ambitious local charities. The reading of the will, held the following Tuesday in the imposing drawing-room of Finch Manor, was a rather tense affair, attended by a handful of relations from various corners of England, and the village solicitor, Mr. Endicott. Miss Marple heard the details second-hand, of course, from Mrs. Witherall, who had heard it from her cousin, who was married to Mr. Endicott's junior clerk. Such was the efficient grapevine of St. Mary Mead. "Well," Mrs. Witherall declared, lowering her voice conspiratorially over her fence with Miss Marple, "it seems he left a considerable sum, a very considerable sum indeed, to Miss Evangeline, and the manor house, too. Imagine, that poor, sad girl." Miss Marple nodded, her fingers deftly weaving a pattern in her lace. "A kind gesture from her uncle, I suppose." "Kind? Oh, Miss Marple, you are too good-natured. It's a fortune, And to think she only arrived a week before he passed. Some might say, convenient. Mrs. Witherall's tone was heavy with implication. And poor Mr. Humphrey Finch, his second cousin from Dorset, who always expected to inherit, got nothing but a paltry annuity. He was quite beside himself, I hear. This news, while certainly providing a clear motive for some, didn't quite sit right with Miss Marple's observations of Miss Evangeline. The young woman had seemed genuinely lost, almost overwhelmed by grief, not the picture of a calculating heiress. But human nature, Miss Marple knew, was a labyrinth of contradictions. Then there was the peculiar incident at the manor itself, reported by Mrs. Gable, the daily charwoman, to Mrs. Garside, who in turn relayed it to Miss Marple during a visit to the grocer's shop. She said it was in the library, Miss Marple, a priceless Chinese vase smashed to smithereens, and Mrs. Gable swears it wasn't there when she left the day before Mr. Finch died. It was one of those new pieces Mr. Finch had shipped over from his travels, and Miss Evangeline was in such a state, saying it must have been an accident. But then Jameson, the butler, looked at her in such a way, Mrs. Gable said, it sent shivers down her spine. A broken vase, a small detail perhaps, but one that seemed to crackle with an unspoken energy. Why would a priceless vase be smashed? And why the hushed reaction? Accidents happened, of course, but the peculiar expressions, the tension, suggested more. Miss Marple envisioned the library, Mr. Finch's sanctum, and a sudden image of the stern, unyielding man flashed through her mind. Was it an accident, or was it a sign of something more violent, something that might have happened before Mr. Finch's demise? The villagers, meanwhile, were primarily focused on the financial implications. Mr. Humphrey Finch, the disgruntled cousin, had made a scene at the solicitor's office, shouting about undue influence and a gross miscarriage of justice. His anger was public, volatile, and quite understandable. He was a prime suspect in the court of public opinion. His motive, clear as a summer day, but Miss Marple's mind kept returning to the vase, and to Jameson, the butler, whose usually impeccable composure had wavered, and to Miss Evangeline, who seemed to carry a burden far heavier than mere grief. She had observed the girl's hands during the funeral, tightly clasped, knuckles white, not merely in sorrow, but as if holding back something else entirely. Fear, perhaps, or guilt? The local constable, P.C. Troughton, dismissed the vase as a domestic mishap, when Mrs. Gable, emboldened by Mrs. Garside, had nervously mentioned it to him. "Nerves, Mrs. Gable," he'd said kindly. "All this excitement at the manor." But Miss Marple knew that sometimes it was precisely these domestic mishaps, these small, overlooked details, that held the key to larger, more significant events. The pieces of the puzzle were still scattered, but one, the broken vase, had just revealed a sharper, more jagged edge than any that had come before it. The tranquil surface of St. Mary Mead was beginning to show cracks. Chapter 4. A Curious Omission and a Secret Visitor. The weeks following Mr. Finch's funeral settled into a new routine, a quiet hum of expectation around Finch Manor. Miss Evangeline Finch, now the mistress of the house, remained largely secluded. The grand renovation efforts ceased, leaving a few rooms unfinished, a curious testament to the abrupt halt in Mr. Finch's plans. Inspector Craddock had returned to the county town, seemingly satisfied that no foul play had occurred. But for Miss Marple, the case was far from closed. The air still vibrated with the faint, unsettling echo of unresolved questions. Her attention was drawn one blustery afternoon by a conversation overheard at the local lending library. Mrs. Long, a keen reader of detective novels, was speaking with Mrs. Price Ridley, the vicar's cousin, a woman known for her sharp wit and even sharper tongue. "I simply can't imagine," Mrs. Long declared, "why Mr. Finch, a man of such precise habits, would not have included a mention of his invaluable first edition of Paradise Lost in his will. He treasured it, you know. Showed it to anyone who would. Listen, Said it was irreplaceable. Mrs. Price Ridley, adjusting her spectacles, sniffed. Perhaps he forgot, my dear. Or perhaps it was deemed too trifling a detail for the formal document. Trifling? Mrs. Long looked aghast. But it was worth a fortune. He acquired it during his travels, I believe, kept it in a special locked display case in his library. Miss Marple, pretending to peruse a volume on horticultural diseases, absorbed this snippet of information. A valuable first edition, unmentioned in the will. This was more than a mere omission. It was a glaring blank in a canvas that Mr. Finch himself had so meticulously painted with his material possessions. A man so precise about his wealth would surely catalogue every significant item. Could it be that the book was simply gone, or never existed? The thought sent a faint shiver down her spine. The broken vase in the library now took on a new significance. Her quiet observations of village life also yielded another intriguing detail. Young Timmy, the butcher's boy, a usually cheerful lad, seemed unusually sullen. When Miss Marple encountered him by the village pond, skipping stones listlessly, she offered him a small, home-baked scone. "What troubles you, Timmy?" she asked, gently. Timmy mumbled, "Nothing, Miss Marple." Then, as if unable to hold it in, he blurted out, "It's just Mr. Abernathy, the gardener. He's been awful quiet, hasn't he? And he's been going up to Finch Manor late at night. I've seen him, tiptoeing through the back lanes, like he don't want no one to see him." "Mr. Abernathy?" Miss Marple's voice was calm, but her mind whirred. "But I thought he had been dismissed." "He was, Miss Marple. That's what's so odd. Why would he be going back there? And he carries a small bag, too. Looks heavy." Timmy then seemed to regret his indiscretion, quickly making an excuse to run off. Mr. Abernathy, the disgruntled former gardener, known for his good riddance to bad rubbish comment, what could he possibly be doing, sneaking back to Finch Manor under the cloak of darkness? Was he simply retrieving his personal belongings, perhaps things he'd left behind in his hasty departure? Or was something more clandestine at play? His public resentment combined with his secret visits painted a picture of a man with unresolved business at the manor. Perhaps he was after something. The missing book, perhaps? Or something else entirely. Miss Marple allowed these thoughts to simmer, her gaze drifting towards the distant, imposing silhouette of Finch Manor against the twilight sky. The house, once a symbol of Mr. Finch's return, now seemed to brood, holding its secrets close. The official story of natural causes felt increasingly thin, like a worn fabric threatening to tear. There were too many loose threads, too many unexplained inconsistencies. A valuable book unmentioned in a meticulous will. A disgruntled former employee secretly visiting the scene of the death, and a grieving niece whose sorrow seemed tinged with something else entirely. The puzzle was becoming more intricate, each new piece adding a layer of complexity. Miss Marple felt a familiar stirring of her intellect. The truth, she suspected, was not to be found in the grand pronouncements of the authorities, but in the quiet whispers, the subtle omissions, and the clandestine movements of those who remained. And somewhere, amongst these threads, lay the secret of Mr. Alistair Finch's last days. Chapter 5. A confession, a denial, and a familiar pattern. Miss Marple, armed with the new information regarding Mr. Abernathy's nocturnal excursions, decided to pay a discreet visit to Mrs. Abernathy, ostensibly to inquire about her prize-winning dahlias. She found Mrs. Abernathy, a weary-looking woman with kind eyes, tending her small garden with a heavy heart. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's been such a trial. What with Alfred being dismissed," Mrs. Abernathy sighed, wiping her brow. "He's not been himself. Not at all. Distant, you know, and out at all hours, indeed," Miss Marple murmured, admiring a particularly vibrant bloom. "One does wonder where he finds the energy." Mrs. Abernathy lowered her voice. "He's been drinking a bit more, too. And he went back to the manor, didn't he? Said he had to settle A score. I don't know what he means, Miss Marple. He just mutters about that devil Finch and what he stole. Stole, you say? Miss Marple's voice remained calm, but her internal gears were turning. This was a new and significant piece. Yes, he wouldn't say what, just that Mr. Finch had cheated him out of something precious. I worry about him, Miss Marple, truly. I do. What if he did something foolish? Mrs. Abernathy wrung her hands. Later that day, Miss Marple encountered Mr. Abernathy himself, rather disheveled, emerging from the Red Lion. She greeted him politely, and to her surprise he paused, his eyes bloodshot, his face etched with a mix of anger and despair. Mr. Abernathy, she began gently, I heard you had a disagreement with Mr. Finch before his passing. I hope it wasn't too unpleasant. He scoffed. Unpleasant? That man was a serpent. He ruined me, Miss Marple, ruined me. Said he'd invest my life savings, my inheritance from my old aunt, in some grand scheme of his, promised me double, treble, and then nothing. Just laughed in my face when I asked for it back. Said it was risky investment, a gentleman's agreement. I lost everything, Miss Marple, everything I had saved for my old age. His voice rose raw with bitterness. And then he sacked me for his blasted roses. Abernathy's story, while a powerful motive for revenge, also explained his secret visits. Was he trying to recover his money, or was he looking for evidence of Mr. Finch's deceit? His confession, however, contained a denial. I swear on my mother's grave, Miss Marple, I didn't lay a hand on the man. I was there, yes, looking for proof, but he was already gone, cold as a stone. Found him that evening, lying there in his library, still as death itself. Gave me a fright, it did. He had found the body. This was new information. He hadn't reported it, fearing he'd be blamed. I panicked, Miss Marple, just ran. Who'd believe me, with all my anger towards him? Miss Marple listened, her gaze unwavering. She believed him about finding the body and the panic, but did she believe him about not laying a hand on the man? Perhaps. His despair seemed genuine. However, his presence at the scene, before the doctor, complicated matters significantly. Why hadn't he come forward? His fear of accusation was logical, but also suspicious. Her thoughts then drifted to Miss Evangeline. Miss Marple made an effort to encounter her, accidentally, by the churchyard where Miss Finch often went to sit, by the ancient yew tree. Evangeline looked wan, her youth overshadowed by a profound weariness. My dear, Miss Marple began softly, I hope you are settling in despite the unfortunate circumstances. Evangeline offered a faint smile. As best. As I can, Miss Marple. The house. It feels so large now, so empty. It must be a great burden, Miss Marple empathized. Such a sudden loss, and then the responsibilities of the estate. And all those new furnishings Mr. Finch had just acquired, I dare say some of them quite valuable. Miss Marple subtly introduced the missing book. That rare edition of Paradise Lost, for instance. Such a magnificent volume, I hear. Evangeline's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of something, perhaps alarm, passing through them before she quickly composed herself. Oh yes, Uncle Alister was very proud of it, but I confess I haven't seen it since his passing. Perhaps it was packed away with some of his other things. Her voice was a little too quick, a little too smooth, a denial, but one that felt rehearsed. Miss Marple observed the subtle tightening around Evangeline's mouth, the brief hesitation, before her answer. It was a familiar pattern in human behavior, the attempt to conceal, the slight over-eagerness to dismiss. It reminded Miss Marple of a young woman in St. Mary Mead who, years ago, had tried to hide a broken family heirloom, pretending it had vanished, only for the fragments to be found later, carefully wrapped. The valuable book, Evangeline's denial, Abernathy's confession of finding the body, his resentment. The pieces were multiplying, each adding its own weight to the growing sense of an untold truth. The official verdict was slowly but surely disintegrating, revealing a complex web of secrets beneath. Chapter 6. A Shadowed Memory and a hidden compartment. The revelation of Mr. Abernathy's past financial dealings with Mr. Finch, combined with his confession of finding the body, cast a long shadow over the village. While the local constable, P.C. Troughton, dismissed it as old news and a drunken ramblings, Miss Marple knew better. Human emotions, particularly resentment and the feeling of being cheated, could simmer for years, only to boil over at an opportune moment. Abernathy had a clear motive, a known presence at the manor, and a history of grievance. He was certainly the prime suspect in the villagers' unspoken judgment. However, Miss Marple's attention was still drawn to Miss Evangeline and the missing Paradise Lost. The book, she felt, was a significant detail. A man as meticulous as Alistair Finch would not simply misplace such a treasure, nor would he omit it from his will without reason. If it was truly missing, its disappearance was directly linked to the time of his death. One crisp autumn afternoon, Miss Marple found herself in the village church, admiring the newly restored stained-glass window, its colors vibrant against the muted stone. It depicted various saints, their faces serene, their gestures symbolic. It was a beautiful piece, and its restoration had been a long-standing project, finally completed just weeks before Mr. Finch's death. As she gazed at the intricate patterns, a memory stirred. She recalled a conversation with Mr. Finch himself, a rare occurrence during his short stay. He had been unusually animated, boasting of his latest acquisition, a rare first edition of Paradise Lost, a book he claimed was unique with a fascinating history. He had gone on to mention, rather pompously, that he had even discovered a clever little hidden compartment within the book's binding, where one could hide the most delicate of secrets. A hidden compartment. Miss Marple's heart gave a little jolt. This was the detail that had been waiting to surface. Why had he mentioned it to her, of all people? Perhaps simply to boast, as was his nature. But the implication was profound. If the book was missing, and if it contained a hidden compartment, then whatever was hidden within it was also missing. And that something could be the true key to Mr. Finch's demise. She considered this. If Abernathy had indeed killed Finch, perhaps in a fit of rage over his lost savings, he might have taken the book. But Abernathy's tale of financial ruin did not immediately align with a desire for a rare book. His anger was about money, concrete and tangible. Evangeline, on the other hand, was the inheritor, the one who stood to gain. Did she know about the compartment? Had she taken the book? Her nervousness when the book was mentioned suggested a deeper knowledge than she admitted. Later that week, a small yet telling incident occurred. Mrs. Gable, the charwoman at Finch Manor, arrived at Miss Marple's cottage looking flustered. "Oh, Miss Marple," she began, twisting her apron, "I don't know what to make of it. Young Bessie, one of the housemaids, she's left, just packed her bags and went without a word to anyone. Jameson, the butler, was furious, said she was unreliable." "Indeed?" Miss Marple asked, offering a comforting cup of tea. "That is rather sudden. And the strange thing is," Mrs. Gable continued, lowering her voice, "I saw her with a man just before she left. A strange man, not from the village. He was giving her a small, quite heavy-looking purse. Miss Marple and Bessie, she looked so frightened, but then she took it and just ran off. A strange man, a heavy purse, and a frightened maid fleeing the manor. This was a new variable, one that added another layer of complexity. Was Bessie somehow involved? Was she paid off? By whom? And what did she know? Her sudden departure suggested a fear of exposure, or perhaps a payment for her silence. The stained-glass window, with its silent saints, seemed to hold more than just light now. It held the echo of Mr. Finch's boast, a memory of a hidden compartment and a secret. The villagers might be content with the simple narrative of Abernathy's revenge, but Miss Marple felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. The game of human nature was rarely so straightforward. The pieces of the puzzle were no longer just scattered. They were beginning to show connections, like invisible threads drawing them closer, revealing a pattern that was both intricate and deeply unsettling. The truth, she sensed, lay not in the obvious, but in the most carefully guarded secret. Chapter 7. A faded photograph and a frightened confession. The sudden disappearance of Bessie, the housemaid, coupled with the revelation of the hidden compartment within the missing Paradise Lost, pushed Miss Marple's deductions into a sharper focus. She felt an insistent tug towards Miss Evangeline Finch. The young woman's carefully composed grief, her evasiveness about the book, and now the maid's flight, all seemed to coalesce around her. Miss Marple decided upon another accidental encounter, this time at the village fête, where Miss Evangeline, though still in mourning, felt obliged to make an appearance. As the two women stood by a stall selling homemade preserves, Miss Marple subtly guided the conversation. "Such a pity about Bessie," Miss Marple remarked, "though I suppose one cannot truly rely on staff these days. Young girls are often too impressionable." Evangeline stiffened almost imperceptibly. "Yes, she was rather flighty." "One wonders what frightens them so," Miss Marple continued, her gaze gentle but piercing. "Sometimes it is a small kindness, and sometimes a great secret that can weigh so heavily on a young conscience." Evangeline turned away, ostensibly to look at a jar of blackberry jam, but Miss Marple noticed the tremor in her hand. "Secrets can be a heavy burden, can't they, Miss Marple?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the fate's gentle clamor. Miss Marple chose her next words carefully. "Indeed, but sometimes revealing them is the only path to true peace, especially when they concern someone we cared for, or perhaps someone we wished we had understood better." Evangeline turned back, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "My uncle, he was not an easy man. He had many enemies." She paused, then, as if a dam had broken, she blurted out, "And he was holding something over me, Miss Marple, something terrible from my past. He threatened to expose it if I didn't comply with his wishes." "And what were his wishes, my dear?" Miss Marple asked softly, her heart aching for the young woman. "He wanted me to marry a man I detested, an old business associate of his, Sir Reginald Bligh, a dreadful man, purely for a merger he was planning. He said if I refused, he would reveal a scandal from my youth, a youthful indiscretion that would ruin my reputation and my family's name forever. He was cruel, Miss Marple, so cruel." Evangeline covered her face with her hands, openly weeping now. "He held my future in his hands." This was a significant confession. Blackmail. A powerful motive indeed for wanting Mr. Finch out of the way. But Evangeline seemed too genuinely distressed, too fragile to be a calculating murderess. Just as Miss Marple was comforting the distraught girl, Mrs. Witherall bustled up, holding a small, faded photograph. "Miss Marple, you must see this. I found it tucked into an old parish magazine someone left at the post office. It's years old, but look." The photograph was sepia-toned, showing a younger, formidable Alistair Finch standing beside a beautiful, dark-haired woman. But it wasn't the woman who caught Miss Marple's eye. It was what Alistair Finch held in his hand, a triumphant smirk on his face, a magnificent, intricately bound book. And on the spine, though faded, the words "Paradise Lost" were just discernible. "What is so remarkable about it, dear?" Miss Marple asked, though she felt a sudden chill. "The woman, Miss Marple." "The woman," Mrs. Witherall exclaimed. "It's Mrs. Hemlock from Hemlock Hall, our Mr. Finch's first wife. She disappeared years ago, didn't she? Said she'd run off with an artist. But some always said there was more to it." Miss Marple looked closely at the photograph, then at Evangeline, who had now lifted her head, her tear-streaked face showing a sudden, intense interest in the picture. The young woman in the photograph was not just beautiful. She bore a striking, almost uncanny resemblance to Evangeline. The same auburn hair, the same delicate bone structure, the same sadness in the eyes. "Mrs. Hemlock, his first wife?" Evangeline whispered, her voice trembling. "But my uncle always said he'd never been married before." The revelation was profound. Alistair Finch had lied about his past, and there was an incredible resemblance between his deceased wife and his niece. A coincidence? Miss Marple never believed in such convenient alignments. The missing Paradise Lost, the hidden compartment, the blackmail, the missing maid, and now a secret first wife who looked remarkably like Evangeline. The seemingly disparate pieces of the puzzle had suddenly, shockingly begun to interlock, forming a picture far darker and more complex than anyone in St. Mary Mead had imagined. The true nature of Mr. Finch's hold over Evangeline, and perhaps the real motive for his death, had just taken a truly unsettling turn. Chapter 8. The True Identity and a Desperate Plea. The faded photograph of Alistair Finch and his first wife, Mrs. Hemlock, who bore such a striking resemblance to Evangeline, sent a ripple of profound insight through Miss Marple's mind. The pieces, which had been orbiting disjointedly, now began to snap into place with alarming clarity. Evangeline's fear, her youthful indiscretion, the cruel blackmail, it all pointed to one chilling possibility. Miss Marple took the opportunity to speak with Evangeline privately after the fete, inviting the girl back to her cottage for a calming cup of tea. Evangeline, still shaken by Mrs. Witherall's unwitting revelation, accepted, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and dawning comprehension. "My dear," Miss Marple began gently, once they were seated in her cozy drawing-room, "that photograph— Tell me, is it possible that Mrs. Hemlock was your mother?" Evangeline gasped, her face paling. "How did you—" Her voice trailed off. "The resemblance is undeniable, my dear. And your uncle's behavior, his insistence on a marriage, his threats of scandal, it all makes a dreadful sense if he was not your uncle at all, but your father. And your mother, his first wife, had perhaps simply disappeared, not run off with an artist, as the story went." Miss Marple's voice was soft, but unwavering. Evangeline burst into fresh tears, this time of raw anguish. Yes, it's true. He was my father. My mother left him when I was a baby. He was a cruel, domineering man even then. She went to live with her sister, my Aunt Martha, and raised me as her own. She changed her name to avoid him, and I grew up believing Martha was my mother, and Uncle Alistair was a distant, barely remembered relative. Yes. She choked back a sob. "But he found me, Miss Marple. He found me only a few months ago. He demanded I come and live at the manor to claim my rightful place," he said. "But then he revealed his true colors, threatening to expose my mother's past, the scandal of leaving her husband, and that I was his illegitimate child born out of wedlock after she supposedly ran off. He twisted everything, Miss Marple. He meant to use me, to control me entirely." The depth of Mr. Finch's cruelty now fully revealed itself. He was not merely a cantankerous old man, but a manipulator, using his own daughter's past against her. His insistence on her marrying Sir Reginald Bligh must have been to secure some financial or social advantage, solidifying his control over Evangeline and her future inheritance. "And the missing book? Paradise Lost?" Miss Marple prompted. "Did your father tell you about the hidden compartment?" Evangeline nodded, trembling. "Yes, he showed it to me. He said he kept his most important insurance in there. Letters. He called them letters that detailed my mother's past and my true parentage. He said they would prove everything and ruin us both if I disobeyed him." The pieces were now fitting together with a horrifying precision. The youthful indiscretion was not Evangeline's, but her mother's, and her own illegitimacy, a stigma in those times. The missing book contained the proof, the leverage. Mr. Finch used to control her. "Bessie, the maid," Miss Marple continued, "did she know about these letters?" Evangeline's eyes darted around the room nervously. She overheard something, a dreadful argument between father and me. She saw the book, and she saw me try to take it from him. He became furious. He said he would fire her if she ever spoke of it. And then Bessie disappeared, paid off by a stranger, you say? Evangeline nodded again, barely able to speak. Yes. I believe it was Father's solicitor, Mr. Endicott. He called me after Father died and said there were private matters to attend to. He was very insistent that certain sensitive documents be recovered. I saw him talking to Bessie. I think he was trying to find the book and the letters for Father, even after he was gone, to maintain the control. Or the puzzle was nearly complete. Mr. Finch was blackmailing his own daughter. The Paradise Lost contained the incriminating letters. Bessie had overheard a heated argument where Evangeline tried to take the book and was then paid off by the solicitor to keep silent and likely help retrieve the book after Finch's death. But the question remained: who had killed Alistair Finch? Evangeline had a motive, a powerful, desperate one, but had she acted on it? She seemed too fragile, too much a victim herself. And Abernathy, while having a financial motive, still claimed. He only found the body. The true picture was almost visible, shimmering beneath the surface, waiting for the final critical detail. The intricate web of deceit and desperation surrounding Finch Manor was finally revealing its true, tragic pattern. Chapter 9. The Missing Ingredient and the Subtle Deception. Miss Marple, her mind now a kaleidoscope of connected facts, revisited the sequence of events. Evangeline's desperate confession, the true nature of Mr. Finch's blackmail, the missing letters, Abernathy's resentment, and his claim of finding the body, and Bessie's sudden departure, seemingly orchestrated by Mr. Endicott. The core of the mystery had shifted from a simple who to a complex how and why, revealing a deeper layer of depravity than anyone had initially suspected. She recalled Dr. Haydock's initial assessment: heart failure, a convenient diagnosis, especially if the cause was subtle. And she remembered Mr. Finch's habits, his precise routine, his solitary evenings in the library. Her thoughts turned to the broken Chinese vase in the library. Evangeline had claimed it was an accident, but Jameson, the butler, had looked at her with suspicion. What if it wasn't an accident? What if it was a struggle? And what if something had been spilled? Miss Marple decided to speak with Jameson, the butler. He was a man of strict decorum, but she had observed profound weariness in him, a quiet grief that went beyond the loss of an employer. She found him in the village, making a rare trip to the hardware shop. "Mr. Jameson," Miss Marple greeted. "A moment, if you please. I was hoping you might enlighten me on a small matter concerning Mr. Finch's health." Jameson, usually so reserved, looked at her, his composure finally cracking. "His health, Miss Marple, or his demise?" "Both, perhaps," she replied gently. "You were with him daily. Did he have any particular ailments you observed?" Jameson sighed, running a hand over his face. He had a nervous tremor in his right hand sometimes, and he often complained of indigestion, especially after his evening brandy. He was quite particular about his brandy, Miss Marple, always the same brand, served at precisely the same temperature. "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured, a new line of thought forming. "And did you ever notice anything unusual in his library? The broken vase, for instance." Jameson's eyes narrowed. "Ah, the vase. Miss Evangeline insisted it was an accident, but it was no accident, Miss Marple. I walked in just after the fact. Mr. Finch was shouting at Miss Evangeline, demanding something. She had the Paradise Lost book in her hands, holding it to her chest, trying to pull away from him. He lunged for it, and the vase, which was on the table beside them, crashed to the floor. And then, well, then he seemed to collapse. Miss Evangeline, she looked utterly terrified. She fled the room, dropping the book in her haste. I saw it, Miss Marple. I picked it up myself." "You picked up the book?" Miss Marple asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Did you notice anything about it?" "Yes, Miss Marple. It was slightly damp. and there was a faint, rather sickly sweet smell about it, like almonds, perhaps. I thought nothing of it at the time, but now Jameson shuddered. And the hidden compartment? I saw it, Miss Marple. Mr. Finch had shown it to me weeks ago, boasting of his private collection of correspondence. After he collapsed, I retrieved the book and, out of a morbid curiosity, opened the compartment. There were letters, yes, and a small empty vial. An empty vial. Dampness. A sickly sweet almond smell. The pieces were now blindingly clear. This was not a simple heart attack. This was poisoning. A slow-acting, insidious poison, perhaps potassium cyanide, which could mimic heart failure and often carried a faint almond scent. The broken vase, the struggle over the book, and the vial, all connected. And the letters? Miss Marple pressed. I read them, Miss Marple. They were indeed scandalous. Proof that Miss Evangeline was his daughter, not his niece, and born out of wedlock after his first wife disappeared. He meant to use them to control her, to force her into a marriage she detested. He was a cruel man, Miss Marple, utterly without conscience. Jameson looked utterly defeated. I couldn't let those letters be found. For Miss Evangeline's sake, for her mother's memory, so I disposed of them, and the vial. The final crucial puzzle piece, Jameson, not a murderer by intent, but a man driven by loyalty and a sense of justice for the wronged. He had witnessed the struggle, seen the poison, and then protected Evangeline, the true victim, by destroying the evidence that would further ruin her. But who had administered the poison? Evangeline, in a moment of desperation, fighting for her freedom? Or had Mr. Finch himself taken it, perhaps by accident, or even by a darker, more manipulative design? The subtle deception now seemed agonizingly clear. Mr. Finch had collapsed during a struggle with Evangeline over the book. The poison, already in his system, had taken its final toll. But who had given it to him? It couldn't have been Evangeline. In that moment, for the poison was slow-acting. The Paradise Lost book, the hidden compartment, the letters, the vial, the struggle, and the loyalty of a long-suffering butler, the entire narrative was finally complete, revealing a tale far more tragic and calculated than any rumor had suggested. The truth, now laid bare, hung heavy in the crisp autumn air of St. Mary Mead. Chapter 10. The Unveiling by the Stained Glass Window. The following Sunday, as the weak autumn sun streamed through the vibrant stained glass window of St. Mary, Mead Church, casting colorful patterns across the ancient stone floor, Miss Marple found herself in a quiet conversation with Inspector Craddock. He had returned to the village, responding to a discreet but insistent letter from Miss Marple, outlining certain overlooked details regarding the Finch case. Jameson, the butler, was also present, looking gaunt but resolute. Miss Evangeline sat a few pews away, fragile and pale. "Inspector," Miss Marple began gently, her voice barely above a whisper, "the death of Mr. Alistair Finch was indeed due to heart failure, as Dr. Haydock initially determined. However, the heart was merely the final organ to succumb to an insidious, slow-acting poison, likely potassium cyanide, administered over a period of time." Craddock's eyes widened. "Poison? But there was no indication." "No, Inspector, because the dosage was subtle, designed to mimic natural decline, to be effective over weeks rather than hours. Mr. Finch would have experienced increasing discomfort, indigestion, a general malaise, all easily dismissed as age or stress. The final fatal dose, however, was clearly taken just before his collapse in the library. She turned to Jameson. "Mr. Jameson, you saw the struggle over the Paradise Lost book, did you not? You found the vial in the hidden compartment, and you disposed of the letters. You acted to protect Miss Evangeline, thinking she might be accused. But you were protecting the wrong person from accusation, weren't you?" Jameson, his shoulders slumped, nodded slowly. I thought perhaps Miss Evangeline, in her desperation to escape his clutches, might have done something. She had every reason? Indeed she did, Miss Marple agreed, her gaze shifting to Miss Evangeline, who flinched, her eyes wide with apprehension. Mr. Finch was blackmailing his own daughter, threatening to expose her true parentage and her mother's past, to force her into an unwanted marriage. The letters in the book were his leverage. Craddock looked from Evangeline to Jameson, then back to Miss Marple, a dawning horror on his face. Then who, Miss Marple, who administered the poison? Miss Marple's eyes, clear and unwavering, settled on Mr. Humphrey Finch, Alistair's second cousin, who stood nervously by the church door, having wandered in ostensibly to admire the stained glass. He was the disgruntled relative who had inherited a paltry sum, publicly accusing Alistair of undue influence. Mr. Humphrey Finch, Miss Marple stated, her voice quiet but firm, you were once a frequent visitor to Finch Manor, were you not, before Mr. Alistair Finch returned? You knew the layout of the house, you knew his habits, and you knew he was a man who enjoyed his evening brandy. Humphrey Finch blanched, his hand flying to his throat. Me? This is preposterous. I merely expected to inherit. Indeed, and when? You discovered Mr. Alistair Finch was returning? A wealthy man, you, as his closest living relative, would have naturally assumed your inheritance was secured. But then he found Miss Evangeline, his long-lost daughter, and made her his primary heir. Your hopes were dashed. You knew Mr. Alistair Finch was a man who held secrets. And you, Mr. Finch, also possess a small, private collection of rare books, do you not? A hobby of yours, I recall hearing from Mrs. Witherall, who remembered you borrowing a book on rare bindings from the village library some months ago. You would have been quite familiar with such things as hidden compartments. Humphrey Finch began to tremble, beads of sweat appearing on his forehead. You knew of the Paradise Lost and its hidden compartment because Mr. Alistair Finch, in his foolish pride, probably boasted of it to you too, just as he did to me. And when he found Evangeline, he likely showed you those letters, using them as further leverage to mock your dwindling inheritance, to show you how completely he controlled his true heir. You saw his cruelty, his absolute power over Evangeline, and perhaps a flicker of an idea formed. Miss Marple paused, her gaze steady. You knew of Mr. Finch's evening brandy. You knew a small, tasteless poison could be slowly administered, disguised as his usual tipple, causing a gradual decline that would naturally be attributed to his age. You knew he'd dismiss it as indigestion. You perhaps slipped into the manor during one of his afternoon drives, or during a servant's day off, to tamper with his brandy bottle in his library. Or perhaps, knowing of the compartment, you even replaced a vial of his medication with the poison, knowing he would take it himself, believing it to be therapeutic. No, Humphrey Finch whispered, his face ashen. Mr. Abernathy found the body, Miss Marple continued, and he saw an empty vial by Mr. Finch. You intended to recover the incriminating letters and the vial after Mr. Finch's death, to remove any trace of the poison, and to claim the Paradise. Lost for yourself, as a keepsake, perhaps. You knew the will would be read, and you expected to inherit. You didn't count on Miss Evangeline inheriting everything, or on Jameson's loyalty, or on a humble housemaid who might have seen something. And you certainly didn't count on a few quiet observations. Craddock stared at Humphrey Finch, then at Miss Marple. The pieces, once scattered, now formed a complete and chilling picture. Humphrey Finch, motivated by greed and resentment, had slowly poisoned his cousin, hoping to inherit a fortune, and then retrieve the incriminating evidence and the valuable book. Bessie, the maid, saw you, didn't she, Mr. Finch? Miss Marple concluded, her voice gentle, but with the force of irrefutable truth. Perhaps leaving the manor late one evening, or entering it unexpectedly, and you paid her off to disappear, with the help of Mr. Endicott, who perhaps thought he was merely managing a sensitive family matter for the estate, unaware of the true horror. Humphrey Finch collapsed into a pew, burying his face in his hands, defeated. The whispers by the stained-glass window had finally revealed their terrible truth. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the heart of St. Mary Mead, where the quietest villages often hold the loudest secrets. I hope this tale of Miss Jane Marple's extraordinary intuition has intrigued you and perhaps made you look a little closer at the world around you. Don't forget to like this story, share it with your friends, and subscribe for more mysteries. Until next time, keep your wits sharp and your observations keen.